Welcome to Lore of the Rings, where we explore the secret paths of Middle-earth and share the stories Tolkien never told. Before we dive in, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from and whether this tale has found you by day or by night. In the golden halls of Tirion, where the light of the two trees once mingled into a radiance beyond mortal comprehension, there stands a throne rarely mentioned in the songs of Middle-earth. It belongs to a prince whose name echoes softly through the legends, so softly that most who study Tolkien's vast mythology pass over him without pause, their attention drawn instead to the fiery tragedy of Feanor or the noble suffering of Finarfin. Yet this prince, Finarfin Finwë in the tongue of his people, held a power and a legacy nearly equal to his more famous brothers. He was the golden son of Finwë, husband to a Teleri princess, father to Galadriel herself, and ultimately the High King of the Noldor in the Blessed Realm. But here is the mystery that haunts his story. Why does the greatest survivor of the Noldoran princes remain invisible in most retellings? Why does the only son of Finwë to defy the madness of the flight from Valinor, the only one to turn back from the doom of the Noldor, the only one to stand before the Valar in humility and be forgiven? Why does he vanish from the popular imagination like morning mist beneath the sun? His brothers sought glory in Middle-earth and found instead ruin and death. Finarfin chose a different path, one that led not to legendary battlefields, but to something far more difficult: reconciliation, restoration, and the long, patient work of healing what others had shattered. His story is one of quiet defiance, of a strength so subtle it appears almost as weakness to those who measure courage only in the clash of swords and the defiance of fate. But make no mistake, Finarfin's choice at the shores of Araman, when he turned his face back toward Valinor while his kindred marched toward doom, was an act of resistance as profound as any battle ever fought against Morgoth. It was the refusal to let pride consume wisdom, the decision to value mercy over vengeance, reconciliation over rebellion. And in the end, while his brothers' names are sung with tragic grandeur, it is Finarfin who endures, Finarfin who rebuilds, Finarfin who leads his people in the final war against the enemy and emerges victorious. Yet the tale of the only Noldoran lord to defy Morgoth's corruption and survive is not one of cowardice, but of a courage almost too subtle to be seen. To understand Finarfin's significance, we must first examine the sources from which his story emerges. For unlike the more prominently featured characters of Tolkien's legendarium, Finarfin's tale requires careful excavation from multiple texts. The Silmarillion provides the basic framework. The youngest son of Finwë, golden-haired like his mother Indais of the Vanyar, who turned back from the flight of the Noldor and was granted kingship over those who remained. But this skeletal outline barely hints at the depth of his character or the theological weight Tolkien ultimately assigned to him. In Unfinished Tales, we find fragments that flesh out his relationships: his marriage to Éowyn, daughter of Alwë of Ulqualinde, which bound him to the Teleri and would later make the kinslaying a personal horror. In the peoples of Middle-earth, particularly in the late essay, The Shibboleth of Feanor, Tolkien reveals that Finarfin was the only one of Finwë's sons to take his mother name as his chosen name, preferring Finwë, noble Finwë, over his father name Ingoldo. This seemingly small detail speaks volumes about his character. He honored both lineages, refusing to let family divisions define him, maintaining loyalty to his mother Indies even as Feanor's faction scorned her as the usurper of Muriel's place. Across Tolkien's drafts and revisions, Finarfin's character evolved from a minor figure, barely sketched, to one of profound importance. In early versions of the Legendarium, he hardly appears at all. But as Tolkien's theology deepened, as he wrestled with questions of obedience and rebellion, of pride and humility, of the difference between heroic defiance and foolish pride, Finarfin emerged as a crucial counterbalance to his brothers. He became the answer to an unspoken question. What does it mean to be heroic when the heroic choice is not to fight? Tolkien's fascination with golden figures runs throughout his mythology. Ingwe, High King of all elves, dwelling nearest to the Valar. The Vanyar themselves, golden-haired and spiritually closest to the powers. And later, Glorfindel, whose very name means golden-haired, who falls fighting a Balrog and is sent back to Middle-earth by the Valar themselves. Finarfin belongs to this lineage of golden light, but with a crucial difference. He is Noldorin in spirit and ambition, inheriting the making skill and the pride of his father's house, yet tempered by the spiritual purity of his mother's Vanyarin blood. He is the bridge between two peoples, two philosophies, two ways of being. And so we will walk his path chronologically, from the golden age of Valinor through the darkening, through the horror of the kinslaying, through his lonely return and unexpected kingship, through the long ages of the First Age when he ruled in the West while his children died in Middle-earth, all the way to the War of Wrath and beyond. We will explore how this forgotten prince defied Morgoth not with a sword, but with something far more dangerous to the enemy's designs. The refusal to be corrupted, the choice to heal rather than to break. But to understand Finarfin's greatest stand, we must first walk into the light of Valinor, right before it was extinguished. Imagine, if you can, the blessed realm in the ages before the darkening. The two trees of Valinor, Talpirion the silver and Laurelin the gold, stood in full flower upon Ezelohar, the green mound before the western gates of Valmar. Their light mingled and waxed and waned in a rhythm older than the sun and moon, creating a radiance that no words can capture. For it was a light not merely of the eyes, but of the spirit itself. Under this imperishable light, the Eldar dwelt in bliss that seemed eternal, and chief among them were the Noldor, the deep elves, the wise and skilled, the makers and crafters, whose city of Tirion upon Tuna was a wonder of white towers and crystal stairs rising toward the stars. This was Finarfin's world in his youth, a world of unending beauty, of art and craft pursued with passionate perfection, of music and poetry and lore accumulating across uncounted years. He was the youngest son of Finwë, who had led the Noldor on the great journey from Cuiveanin to Valinor in the elder days. His mother was Indies of the Vanyar, golden-haired and gentle, whom Finwë had married after the death of his first wife Muriel. This made Finarfin younger than his half-brother Feanor by a considerable span of years, and the age difference, combined with the family tensions surrounding Finwë's remarriage, shaped the dynamics of their relationship from the beginning. Feanor was the eldest, the most gifted, the creator of the Silmarils and countless other wonders, but also the most proud and suspicious. He viewed Indies and her children as usurpers, regardless of the fact that his mother Muriel had chosen to abandon her body and dwell in the halls of Mandos. Fingolfin, the second son and Finarfin's full brother, was strong and valiant, a natural leader of warriors, but also caught in the impossible position of trying to maintain peace between Feanor's faction and his own. And then there was Finarfin, youngest, often overlooked, golden-haired like his mother, temperamentally suited to mediation and diplomacy rather than to the passionate intensity that characterized his older brothers. In those bright years, Finarfin served as a bridge between the sometimes fractious houses of the Noldor. When Feanor's pride grew too heated, when arguments threatened to spill over into lasting feuds, it was often Finarfin who found the words to cool tempers, who reminded all parties of their kinship and shared purpose. He had inherited his mother's gentle spirit, but he was no weakling. He possessed the Noldoran passion for knowledge and craft, the keen intelligence of Finwë's house, and a diplomatic skill that made him invaluable in the complex social world of Tirion. His marriage to Éowyn, daughter of Alwë, king of the Teleri in Olqualanda, further cemented his role as a unifier. The Teleri had been the last of the three kindreds to complete the Great Journey, and some lingering division existed between the sea-loving Teleri and the craft-focused Noldor. Finarfin's union with Éowyn bridged that gap, creating family ties between Tirion and Olqualanda, between the city of jewelsmiths and the city of white ships and silver harps. Their children, Finrod, Angrod, Egnor, and Galadriel, inherited the strengths of both lineages, combining Noldoran skill and passion with Teleri wisdom and adaptability. For uncounted years, this harmony persisted. Feanor created his great works, including the Silmarils, those three jewels in which he captured the mingled light of the two trees. Fingolfin led his people with strength and fairness. Finarfin moved between courts, a respected figure whose counsel was sought in matters requiring delicacy and wisdom. The Noldor flourished, and if there were tensions beneath the surface, Feanor's growing possessiveness over his creations, Morgoth's subtle poisoning of discourse after his release from imprisonment, the slowly accumulating resentments between houses, they seemed manageable, containable, insufficient to crack the foundations of paradise. And just when all seemed eternal, the first shadow touched the heart of Ammon. The unmaking of paradise began subtly, as corruption often does in Tolkien's world. Melkor, whom the elves would later name Morgoth, the Dark Enemy, had been imprisoned in the halls of Mandos for 3 ages after his capture. When he was finally brought before the Valar in chains, he feigned repentance so convincingly that Manwë, who cannot comprehend evil because his nature is utterly good, believed him reformed and granted him limited freedom within Valinor. This was the first great mistake, the crack through which darkness would pour. Melkor walked in Valinor, seemingly humble, offering counsel and friendship to all who would hear him. But his true purpose was to sow discord among the Eldar, particularly among the proud Noldor. He whispered to Feanor about the Valar's supposed jealousy of elven skill, suggested that the powers kept the elves in Ammon as prisoners rather than guests, hinted that men would awaken in Middle-earth, and the Valar would give them lands the elves might have ruled. To others he spoke differently, always calibrating his lies to match the particular fears and desires of his audience. Finarfin, temperamentally inclined to trust and to seek the good in others, initially gave Melkor the benefit of doubt. But as tensions in Tirion escalated, as Feanor grew more paranoid and volatile, as whispers of division spread through the Noldor, Finarfin began to perceive the pattern. Unlike his older brothers, whose attention was focused on each other and on their own ambitions, Finarfin maintained connections across all the elven kindreds. He heard what the Vanyar said, what the Teleri observed, what his mother Indais feared. And slowly, he came to understand that a poison was working through his people, something subtle and malicious, turning their greatest strengths, their passion, their pride, their creative ambition into sources of conflict. But understanding came too late. The crisis escalated rapidly. Feanor, convinced that Finarfin plotted to usurp his place, drew his sword on his half-brother at a public assembly, an act so shocking, so utterly contrary to the peace of Valinor, that the Valar had no choice but to act. Feanor was exiled from Tirion for 12 years, and he departed with his father Finwë to his fortress at Forminos in the north, taking the Silmarils with him. The house of Finwë was divided, and the shadow deepened. Then came the night that ended the ancient world. During a festival in Valmer, when most of the Noldor were present, Melkor and the great spider Ungoliant came to the two trees. Melkor pierced their trunks with his spear, and Ungoliant drank the light from them, draining their radiance until they stood dead and dark, mere skeletons of what they had been. Darkness fell upon Valinor for the first time since the lamps were overthrown in the ancient days. In that darkness, Melkor fled north to Forminos, murdered Finwë, and stole the Silmarils and many other treasures of the Noldor. Finarfin learned of his father's death not in the comfort of family, but amid chaos and gathering darkness. The light of the trees was gone. Their father was slain. Feanor, mad with grief and rage, was even now returning to Tirion, and rumors suggested he came not for counsel but for vengeance. The world that had seemed eternal for thousands upon thousands of years had shattered in a single night. When Feanor spoke before the assembled Noldor in Tyrion's square, Finarfin stood with his people and listened to his half-brother's burning words. Feanor spoke of Melkor, now named Morgoth, the black foe of the world. He spoke of the theft of the Silmarils, of their father's murder, of the darkness that had fallen upon Ammon. But more than this, he spoke of Middle-earth, of the wide lands across the sea where the Noldor might rule as kings, where no Valar would constrain their freedom or judge their deeds. His words were brilliant and terrible, designed to inflame every grievance, every ambition, every half-formed desire for independence that Morgoth's earlier whispers had planted. And the Noldor responded. The greater part of them, caught up in Feanor's rhetoric and their own grief and rage, swore to follow him to Middle-earth, to pursue Morgoth, to reclaim the Silmarils, to carve out kingdoms for themselves in the lands of the hither shores. Fingalfin's house joined the march, not from agreement with Feanor, but from unwillingness to let their people go into danger without leadership. And Finarfin, bound by kinship and loyalty, by the desperate hope that he might yet serve as a voice of reason, by the terrible fear that his brothers and his people were marching toward disaster, Finarfin also went with them. But in his heart, seeds of doubt were already growing. Because unlike Feanor, who had always chafed against the Valar's counsel, and unlike Fingalfin, who was focused primarily on protecting his people and maintaining his honor against Feanor's faction, Finarfin had spent his life building bridges between the kindreds. He knew the Vanyar's perspective. He knew the Tellerie's wisdom. He had listened when others spoke of the Valar with respect and gratitude rather than resentment. And he had married into the house of Alwe, had friends and family among the people of Ulqualinde who would not view the Noldor's departure with approval. As the host of the Noldor marched north from Tirion, as they made their way toward the coast, and the inevitable question of how they would cross the sea, Finarfin's unease grew with every step, because the story did not end with a simple departure. It was about to become a tragedy darker than any yet imagined. And then came the moment that would cleave his heart forever, the call to the kinslaying. The host of the Noldor reached Ulqualinde, the haven of swans in the northern reaches of Ammon. Here dwelt the Teleri, the sea elves, masters of shipbuilding and sailing, who loved their white vessels more than any treasure. Their city was beautiful beyond measure, white towers and white walls rising from the shore, and anchored in the harbor, the swan ships with their silver prows, rocking gently on the waves, singing with the voices of the sea. Feanor's purpose in coming here was clear. He required ships to carry the Noldor to Middle-earth, and the Teleri possessed the greatest fleet in Ammon. So he approached Alwe, the Teleri king, who was Finarfin's father-in-law, and demanded the use of their vessels. But Alwe refused. The Teleri had no quarrel with Morgoth, no desire for revenge or conquest. The swan ships were not merely transportation, but works of art, of love, each one crafted over decades or centuries, imbued with the spirits of their makers. To send them away to war, to let them leave the blessed shores of Ammon, was unthinkable. Moreover, the Valar had not condoned the Noldor's departure, and the Teleri were not willing to defy the powers for the sake of Feanor's vengeance. Feanor, faced with this refusal, had a choice. He could turn back, could accept the Valar's implicit disapproval signaled by the Teleri's refusal and reconsider his course. He could seek another way, build his own ships, find a different path, pause and reflect on whether this entire flight from Valinor was truly wisdom or merely wounded pride. But Feanor had passed beyond the point where he could hear reason. The darkness that Morgoth had planted in him, watered by grief and rage at his father's murder, had grown into an all-consuming obsession. If he could not have the ships by permission, he would take them by force. What followed was the first shedding of elven blood by elven hands in all the history of Arda. The Noldor, armed and desperate, attacked the Teleri in their own harbor. The Teleri, though less warlike than the Noldor, were not helpless. They defended their ships with whatever they could seize, with bows and with oars and with their own hands. The waters of Ulqualinde ran red with blood. The swan ships were torn from their moorings. The singing of the waves was drowned by screams of the dying and the clash of battle. Silver harps lay abandoned on the quays. Bodies floated in water that had known only peace for countless ages. Finarfin's host arrived at Ulqualinde behind Feanor's vanguard. The accounts in the Silmarillion are carefully worded, leaving some ambiguity about exactly when each faction arrived and what they knew. But this much is clear. Finarfin did not initiate the violence. His temperament, his family ties to Alwe, everything we know of his character argues that he would have sought peaceful resolution. But once battle was joined, once the kinslaying had begun, the other Noldorin hosts were swept into the chaos, some thinking they came to the aid of their kindred under attack, others simply caught in the momentum of violence, still others perhaps succumbing to the same darkness that had taken Feanor. For Finarfin, the horror must have been absolute. These were his wife's people. Alwe was his father-in-law. Among the Teleri dying on those bloodied quays might have been those he had known for centuries, had shared songs with, had welcomed at his hearth. And yet here he stood, caught in a nightmare not of his making, watching his own people commit an atrocity against innocents who had done nothing beyond refusing to aid in what they rightly saw as a doomed rebellion. The kinslaying was brief but devastating. The Noldor, more experienced in warfare and more heavily armed, overwhelmed the Teleri's resistance. The swan ships were seized. Many of the Teleri lay dead. The survivors fled inland, bearing news of the betrayal to Valmer. And the Noldor, now stained with innocent blood, loaded into the stolen vessels and sailed north along the coast, while others marched along the shore, driven forward by momentum and shame, and the terrible knowledge that there was no going back now, that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. As the waves turned red, Finarfin understood what none of the Noldor yet dared face. This path led only to doom. They had not traveled far up the coast of Araman, that cold northern region where the light of the trees had barely reached even in the days of their flowering, when a figure appeared before the host of the Noldor. Mandos himself, the doomsman of the Valor, who knows all fates and speaks only truth, materialized in their path. His presence brought a silence more profound than any speech. Even Feanor stilled. Even the most proud and defiant among the Noldor felt the weight of judgment descending. And Mandos spoke. His words are recorded in the Silmarillion in a passage of terrible beauty, a doom that is both prophecy and curse, revealing the fate that would befall the Noldor for their rebellion and for the blood they had shed. He spoke of exile, that they were banished from Valinor for the slaying of their kin, that the Valor would not aid them, that their oaths and their pride would betray them. He prophesied that they would win no permanent victory against Morgoth, that they would be overthrown and slain, that treason would awaken among them. He foretold that they would lose all that they loved, that their works would fail, and that they would fade in Middle-earth. But most terribly, he proclaimed that those who had spilled blood at Olqualanda were under a specific curse. That blood would follow blood, that kin would slay kin, that the stain would never be washed away. And he warned that even if they achieved their purpose and reclaimed the Silmarils, the jewels themselves would burn them, rejecting their touch because of the evil they had done. The doom of Mandos fell upon the host of the Noldor like a wave of ice. Some wept, some stood stunned. Some raged that the Valor would condemn them for seeking justice for Finwë's murder. But all heard the words, and all understood at some level that they had passed a point of no return. All except one understood it as something more. Finarfin heard the doom differently than his brothers. Where Feanor heard only the Valor's judgment and defied it, where Fingolfin heard fate and grimly accepted it as the price of loyalty to his people, Finarfin heard the anguish beneath the pronouncement. Mandos does not lie. He does not manipulate. He simply states what is true, what will come to pass. And what Finarfin understood in that moment, with a clarity that pierced through all the grief and rage and confused loyalty that had driven him this far, was that Mandos was not condemning them from cruelty, but warning them out of sorrow. The Valor had not rejected the Noldor. The Noldor had rejected the Valor, and what Mandos spoke was simply the natural consequence of that choice, the inevitable doom of pride and violence carried to their logical conclusion. Here was the crossroads. Here was the moment that would define Finarfin's entire existence. His brothers had already chosen their paths, Feanor toward defiant destruction, Fingolfin toward tragic nobility. Now Finarfin had to choose his own. He thought of his father, murdered by Morgoth, whose death demanded justice. He thought of his brothers, marching toward certain doom, who would need all the help they could get. He thought of the Noldor, his people, now stained with innocent blood but still his kin, his responsibility. Every tie of loyalty and family urged him forward, to continue with the host, to see this through to whatever bitter end awaited. But he also thought of the Teleri, of the red water and the abandoned harps. He thought of Éowyn, his wife, and whether she could ever look upon him again without seeing the blood of her kindred on his hands. He thought of the Valor, whom he had known all his life not as tyrants, but as teachers and guardians, whose wisdom he had always trusted even when it was difficult. He thought of the light of the two trees, now lost forever, and the darkness that had come to Valinor, a darkness that, he now understood, had come not from the Valor's failure, but from choices made in pride and anger, from the corruption that Morgoth sowed, and that the Noldor had allowed to grow. And Finarfin understood that continuing forward would not honor his father's memory. It would only compound the tragedy. Finwë would not have wanted his sons to destroy themselves and their people in pursuit of vengeance. Finwë, who had led the Noldor to Ammon in trust and hope, would have counseled wisdom and restraint. The choice Finarfin made in that moment was the hardest choice in the history of his people. Not to fight when all his instincts and his culture and his family urged him to battle. Not to pursue vengeance when he had every right to rage against the murderer of his father. Not to follow his brothers when loyalty screamed at him to stand by their side, but to turn back, to return to Valinor, to humble himself before the Valor, to accept judgment and seek forgiveness, to choose mercy over justice, peace over pride, the hard path of reconciliation over the seductive simplicity of righteous anger. This was Finarfin's defiance of Morgoth, not with a blade, but with a refusal to let Morgoth's corruption define him. Because Morgoth's entire strategy depended on breaking the unity of the free peoples, on turning them against each other, on getting them to act from fear and pride and rage rather than from wisdom and love. Every elf who fell to darkness, every kinslaying, every broken oath was a victory for the enemy. And Finarfin, in turning back, denied Morgoth that victory. As the doom echoes across the cold northern shores, Finarfin listens and chooses a different kind of courage. But defiance has many forms, and Finarfin's battle was not yet done. Imagine the loneliness of that return journey. Finarfin turned back from Araman with a portion of the Noldor, not the majority, but a significant number who heard his words and found in them the courage to make the same terrible choice. They walked south along the abandoned roads, retracing the path of their departure, returning to Tirion under skies darker than they had ever known, for the trees were dead, and the Valor had not yet placed the sun and moon in the heavens. Every step must have been weighted with shame and second-guessing. Every empty vista must have whispered accusations. They had left as part of a great host, driven by purpose however misguided. They returned diminished, defeated without having fought, bearing the stain of the kinslaying without even the cold comfort of continuing the quest that had supposedly justified it. In the eyes of those who had marched on with Feanor and Fingolfin, they were cowards who had abandoned their kin at the first hardship. In the eyes of the Teleri they would encounter, they were kinslayers who deserved no mercy. In their own hearts, they carried unbearable complexity, relief at having turned from a doomed path, grief at the division of their people, guilt over both the blood that stained them and the brothers they had left to face doom alone. Finarfin led them through this darkness, both literal and spiritual. He had made the choice for himself, but he also bore responsibility for those who had followed him. Their fate was now bound to his decision. If he had been wrong, if turning back proved to be cowardice rather than wisdom, then he had led them not to salvation, but to shame. The weight of leadership had fallen upon him in the worst possible circumstances. When they reached Tirion, the city was not as they had left it. Some Noldor had never joined the march, the very young, the very old, those whose spirits simply could not accept Feanor's call. These looked upon the returning host with mixed emotions. Relief that some had come back, horror at the news they brought of the kinslaying, grief at the division of families, for many of those who remained had kin among the host that marched on to Middle-earth. The Vanyar, dwelling in their own city upon Tanaquetil and throughout Valinor, received the news with deep sorrow. These were Indi's people, Finarfin's mother's kin, and they had always viewed the Noldor's pride with a mixture of affection and concern. Now their fears had been realized in the worst possible way. Yet they did not turn away from Finarfin. He was of their blood, and he had chosen to return, which mattered more than the fact that he had left. The Telleries' reaction was more complex. The survivors of Ulqualinde returned to their city bearing their dead and their grief. The swan ships were gone, stolen and sailing toward Middle-earth bearing those who had murdered their makers' kin. The betrayal cut deep, deeper perhaps than even the deaths, because it shattered trust that had existed for millennia. The Noldor had been friends, allies, family in many cases. That such folk could turn to violence against them was almost incomprehensible. Yet even in their grief, the Teleri recognized a distinction. Finarfin had not led the kinslaying. He had turned back. He came to them bearing no excuses, only sorrow and acknowledgement of what had been done. And he was married to Eärwen, Alw's daughter, which made him family still despite everything. The Telleries' capacity for forgiveness, born of their connection to Ulmo and the timeless patience of the sea, would eventually extend even to this darkest of betrayals, though the memory would never fade, and the shadow of Ulqualinde would lie between Noldor and Teleri for ages to come. But the most crucial judgment came from the Valar themselves. Finarfin, bearing the weight of leadership for his people and the specific weight of his own participation in the early stages of the march, presented himself before the powers in Valmer. This required extraordinary courage to stand before beings of such majesty and power, to confess his role in the rebellion and the violence, to submit himself to whatever judgment they deemed appropriate. He could not claim innocence. He had left Valinor against the counsel of the Valar. He had been present at Ulqualinde, however conflicted his role. He bore responsibility. The Valar did not respond with wrath. Their judgment was measured with both justice and mercy, qualities that, in Tolkien's mythology, always exist in balance within the minds of the powers. They acknowledged the wrong that had been done. They affirmed the doom that Mandos had spoken, for what is doomed cannot be recalled. But they also recognized Finarfin's choice to return, his rejection of the path of pride, his willingness to humble himself and seek forgiveness. And then they offered him something extraordinary: leadership over the Noldor who remained in Valinor. His father Finwë was dead. His half-brother Feanor had rejected all authority save his own, and was now in exile from Ammon forever. His brother Fingolfin had followed Feanor into banishment. Of Finwë's sons, only Finarfin remained in the Blessed Realm. And so he was made High King of the Noldor in Ammon, not as a reward, for his position came with unbearable burden, but as recognition that he alone had demonstrated the wisdom and humility necessary for such leadership in this darkest of hours. And so the forgotten prince became the unexpected king. What does a king do when his kingdom has been shattered? When the majority of his people have marched into exile, when the light that illuminated his realm for uncounted ages has been extinguished, when trust between the kindreds has been broken in blood. Finarfin faced these questions in the darkness that followed the flight of the Noldor, and his answers would shape the entire remainder of the First Age. His first task was healing, both literally and metaphorically. The Noldor who remained in Valinor, whether those who had never left or those who returned with Finarfin, needed leadership to navigate their grief and shame. Families were divided, with some members in Middle-earth and others in Ammon, not knowing if they would ever see each other again. The guilt over the kinslaying hung heavy over all who had been present. The loss of the trees, the death of Finwë, the curse of Mandos, these wounds needed tending. Finarfin proved himself worthy of his kingship through patient, careful work that makes for few dramatic tales, but changes the foundation of civilizations. He spoke with families torn apart by the division, helping them bear their grief. He led efforts to maintain and preserve the culture and knowledge of the Noldor, ensuring that what had been learned and made over millennia would not be lost in the catastrophe. He served as intermediary between the Noldor and the other kindreds, slowly rebuilding trust that had been shattered at Ulqualinde. This last task was perhaps the most difficult. The Telleries' grief was profound, and many among them could not easily forgive. But Finarfin did not demand forgiveness or make excuses. He acknowledged the wrong, accepted responsibility for his people, and offered what restitution lay within his power. Over time, and time moves differently in Ammon, where immortals measure ages rather than years, bridges were rebuilt. Not to the fullness of what had been before, for some things once broken cannot be perfectly restored, but to a new kind of relationship forged in the acknowledgement of tragedy and the choice to move forward despite it. Finarfin also worked to heal the division between the Noldor and the Vanyar. His mother Indi's people had always been somewhat puzzled by Noldoran intensity and pride, and the flight from Valinor confirmed their worst fears about where that pride could lead. Yet Finarfin embodied both heritages, Noldoran in his love of craft and knowledge, Vanyarin in his spiritual openness and humility. He became a living bridge between the kindreds, demonstrating that the best of both traditions could coexist. But Finarfin's kingship was not merely reactive, not merely about managing wounds and maintaining what remained. He also led a renewal of Noldoran culture in Valinor. The craft halls of Tirion were restored. New works were created, not to replace what had been lost or stolen, for the Silmarils could never be replicated, but to continue the tradition of making and shaping that defined the Noldor. Music returned to the city, though it was tinged now with sorrow and memory. The lore masters continued their studies, and new knowledge was gained even in diminishment. And crucially, Finarfin maintained awareness of events in Middle-earth. News came across the sea, sometimes by way of the Valor, sometimes through means less clear. He learned of the landing in Loskr and Feanor's burning of the ships, stranding Fingolfin's host to make the terrible crossing of the Helcaraxe. He learned of Feanor's death in battle with Balrogs. He learned of the founding of the Noldoran kingdoms in Beleriand, Fingolfin in Hithlum, Finrod Finarfin's own son in Nargothrond, Turgon in hidden Gondolin. He learned of battles won and lost, of the long siege of Angband, of years of relative peace followed by catastrophic defeats. And he learned of his children's fates, which must have been the cruelest burden of all. Finrod, his eldest son, who made friends with men when they first entered Beleriand, who held Nargothrond for centuries, who died in Sauron's dungeons fulfilling an oath of friendship to Beren. Angrod and Egnor, his younger sons, who fell in the dagger Bragalach, the battle of sudden flame, when Morgoth broke the siege of Angband and fire swept across Beleriand. Only Galadriel, his daughter, survived the First Age, but even she was exiled from Valinor, unable to return, bearing her own complicated guilt and pride. This was Finarfin's reality for the entirety of the First Age: to rule in Valinor while his children died in Middle-earth. To know that they faced Morgoth's malice and he could not help them, could not counsel them, could not even mourn with them when their siblings fell. He had chosen to turn back, had chosen wisdom and peace over the doomed quest for the Silmarils. That choice had saved his own life and the lives of those who followed him. But it had also meant accepting permanent separation from his children, watching from afar as they lived and died in a war he had refused to fight. The guilt must have been crushing at times. The second guessing, what if he had stayed? What if his presence could have made a difference? What if he could have counseled Finrod differently, or stood beside Angrod and Egnor in their last battle? But Finarfin had made his choice, and he did not unmake it. He bore the consequences with the same quiet strength that had enabled him to turn back from Araman in the first place. And then, after centuries of news growing progressively worse, after the fall of all the great Noldoran kingdoms save hidden Gondolin, after Morgoth's victory seemed all but complete, the situation changed. Eärendil the Mariner, bearing a Silmaril upon his brow, sailed to Valinor and cast himself upon the mercy of the Valar, pleading for aid for both elves and men in Middle-earth. His plea, made not from pride but from desperate love for the people of both his kindreds, moved the Valar to action in a way the Noldor's rebellion never could have. The Valar gathered their forces for war against Morgoth, the War of Wrath, the final conflict of the First Age. And Finarfin's long kingship in the West suddenly became preparation for something entirely unexpected. He would lead the Noldor of Valinor into battle against the enemy his brothers had died fighting. This is the part of Finarfin's story that almost never gets told, that is mentioned in the Silmarillion in a single brief passage, but carries enormous implications. Finarfin led the Noldor from Valinor in the War of Wrath. He marched with the hosts of the Valar into Middle-earth. After turning back from the flight, after choosing peace over war, after spending the entire First Age rebuilding rather than fighting, he finally took up arms against Morgoth. But this time with the blessing of the Valar, as part of a just and sanctioned war rather than a doomed rebellion driven by pride. The War of Wrath lasted for decades and devastated Beleriand so thoroughly that most of it sank beneath the sea. But it achieved what the Noldor's rebellion never could have. Morgoth was defeated utterly, cast out of the world into the void beyond creation. His armies were destroyed. His fortresses were broken. The First Age ended in fire and ruin, but also in victory. And Finarfin, who had turned away from war in the darkness before the First Age began, was present at its ending, not as a conqueror seeking glory, but as a king doing what was necessary to protect his people and all the free peoples of Middle-earth. His defiance of Morgoth, which had begun with the choice to turn back from Araman, was completed on the battlefields of Beleriand. He had fought Morgoth not with early, doomed defiance, but with patient preparation and right timing, joining the fight when it could actually be won rather than when pride demanded action. And in the end, Finarfin's legacy would far outlast the fiery deeds of his brothers. When the War of Wrath ended and the hosts returned to Valinor, Finarfin came back to Tirion as the last surviving son of Finwë. His half-brother Feanor had died in the early years of the First Age, burned by his own inner fire and the wounds of Balrogs. His brother Fingolfin had fallen in single combat with Morgoth himself, a death of legendary courage, but death nonetheless. His father Finwë had been murdered by Morgoth before the exile even began. Of all Finwë's sons, those proud princes of the Noldor who had stood in the light of the two trees and seemed eternal and unbreakable, only Finarfin remained. This survival was not triumph but burden. He alone carried the memories of all that had been lost, all the choices made and unmade, all the paths taken and refused. He knew what his brothers had been in their glory, before pride and rage twisted them. He remembered his father's wisdom and strength. He carried the weight of the entire history of his house, the brightest and the darkest moments, the greatest achievements and the most terrible failures. And he carried the specific grief of his children's fates. 3 of his 4 children were dead. Finrod, who had been the first to befriend men, who had made himself into a wise king and a faithful friend, had died in Sauron's dungeons, torn apart by a werewolf while defending Beren. The circumstances were heroic. Finrod had fulfilled an oath of friendship and saved Beren's life. But heroism does not make loss easier to bear. Angrod and Egnor had fallen together in the dagger Bragalach, defending their people against Morgoth's assault, dying as warriors, but dying nonetheless, their lives cut short by the very war Finarfin had turned away from. Only Galadriel survived, and she did not return to Valinor. She remained in Middle-earth, bearing the ban of the valor that applied to all Noldor who had participated in the rebellion. Though she had not been involved in the kinslaying, indeed, she had opposed it. She had still joined the exile, driven by her own pride and her desire to rule a realm of her own in Middle-earth. That choice now meant eternal separation from her father, for the ban was absolute. Or so it seemed for age upon age. Finarfin would wait thousands of years of mortal time before Galadriel earned her return to Valinor through her refusal of the One Ring when Frodo offered it to her in the Third Age. Only then, after demonstrating that she had overcome the pride that drove her into exile, would she be permitted to sail west and finally be reunited with her father. But that reunion lay in a future Finarfin could not foresee as he ruled in Tirion after the War of Wrath. The nature of his immortality became both blessing and curse. He did not age, he did not sicken, he did not face the mortal's terror of oblivion, but he also did not forget. Every loss remained vivid, every grief stayed fresh. The weight of memory accumulated across ages in a way that mortals, whose lives are mercifully brief and whose memories fade, can barely comprehend. And yet Finarfin endured. He continued to rule the Noldor in Valinor through the Second Age and into the Third. He maintained the culture and learning of his people. He ensured that the craft halls continued to produce works of beauty. He kept the memory of all that had been lost, his father, his brothers, his children, alive in song and story. He became, in essence, the keeper of his people's history, the living link between the glory of the elder days and the diminished ages that followed. His brothers had sought glory and achieved it, in a sense. Feanor's name would be remembered forever as the greatest craftsman of the Noldor, the maker of the Silmarils, the most gifted and most tragic of all the Eldar. Fingolfin's duel with Morgoth would be sung until the end of days, the High King who gave the Dark Enemy 7 permanent wounds and made him fear in his own domain. Their stories blazed like stars, bright and terrible and impossible to forget. But Finarfin's story was different, quieter, longer, less obviously heroic. He was the one who chose humility over pride, who turned back when all momentum drove forward, who spent ages rebuilding what others had broken. His courage was the courage of patience, of accepting limitation, of doing the necessary work even when it lacks glory. And while such courage rarely makes for stirring songs, it is perhaps the truest and hardest courage of all. His brothers sought glory. Finarfin inherited the grief of an entire people. Why has Finarfin's story been largely forgotten, even among devoted students of Tolkien's legendarium? Why, when we think of the sons of Finwë, do our minds immediately leap to Feanor's brilliance and tragedy, or to Fingolfin's heroic defiance, but hesitate when encountering Finarfin's name? The answer lies partly in the structure of Tolkien's narratives and partly in deeper questions about what kinds of stories capture human imagination. The Silmarillion, as published, focuses primarily on events in Middle-earth during the First Age. This makes sense. It is the story of the Silmarils, of the war against Morgoth, of the great kingdoms and terrible battles that shaped the history of the world. Finarfin's choice to remain in Valinor meant that he was largely absent from these central narratives. While his brothers and children were fighting and dying in Beleriand, while the great tragedies were unfolding in Middle-earth, Finarfin was ruling in Tirion, far from the action. From a narrative perspective, this creates a problem. Stories require conflict, change, dramatic tension. A king ruling wisely and peacefully for centuries, rebuilding his people's culture, mediating between factions, maintaining stability. These are extraordinarily important activities, but they don't generate the kind of narrative momentum that drives epic fantasy. There are no battles to describe, no dramatic reversals, no tragic flaws working themselves out to inevitable doom. Just patient, steady work across uncounted years. Moreover, Finarfin's survival itself works against his legendary status. In the mythic structures that Tolkien was consciously evoking, the greatest heroes are often those who die young, who burn bright and briefly, whose stories have the perfection of completion. Achilles choosing short life and eternal glory over long life and obscurity. Roland dying at Roncesvalles. Cuchulainn binding himself to a rock so he can die standing. Feanor and Fingolfin fit this pattern perfectly. They blaze across the First Age and then are gone, their stories complete, their legends secured by death. But Finarfin endures. He lives through the tragedy and beyond it. He does not get the dramatic death that crystallizes a character into legend. Instead, he continues through the ages, carrying grief and memory, doing the necessary work of the living. And there is something in human nature that finds such figures less compelling than those who exit dramatically. We admire the survivor intellectually, but we are moved by the tragic hero emotionally. There is also the question of the virtues Finarfin embodies. Humility, patience, the willingness to turn back from a chosen path, the courage to seek forgiveness. These are admirable qualities, but they don't inspire the same visceral response as Feanor's passionate defiance or Fingolfin's heroic last stand. Finarfin's greatest moment of courage, when he turned back from the flight of the Noldor, looks to the casual observer like retreat, like giving up, like abandoning his people in their hour of need. It requires deep moral reflection to understand that this was actually the harder and braver choice. Tolkien himself contributed to Finarfin's relative obscurity by the way he developed the legendarium. In early versions of the mythology, Finarfin barely appears. He becomes more significant in later revisions, particularly in materials published posthumously in the History of Middle-earth series. But even there, he remains less developed than his brothers, more of a supporting figure than a protagonist. And yet, there is something profoundly important about Finarfin precisely because he doesn't fit the typical heroic mold. In a legendarium filled with tragic heroes destroyed by their virtues taken to extremes, Fëanor by his creative passion, Turin by his pride, even Gandalf temporarily by his willingness to sacrifice himself, Finarfin stands as a different possibility. He shows that heroism can consist of knowing when not to fight, that wisdom sometimes means accepting limitation, that the greatest strength can be the willingness to say, "I was wrong," and choose a different path. This is a deeply Christian theme, actually, though Tolkien would resist calling it that explicitly. The whole movement of Christian theology toward concepts like humility, self-sacrifice, forgiveness, the last being first and the first being last. These are deeply countercultural values that Tolkien, as a devout Catholic, naturally wove into his mythology. Finarfin embodies these values more purely than almost any other character in the Silmarillion. He is not without flaw. He participated in the rebellion initially, was present at Ulqualinde, however complex his involvement. But he recognizes his error and chooses to change course, accepting judgment and seeking reconciliation. But perhaps the forgetting is exactly why his story matters now. In an age that still celebrates individual defiance, that valorizes the tragic hero who refuses to compromise, that often mistakes pride for strength and humility for weakness, Finarfin's story offers a different model. It suggests that sometimes the truly courageous choice is to turn back, to admit error, to choose peace over the seductive righteousness of justified anger. It proposes that the work of healing and rebuilding, unglamorous as it may be, is as heroic as any battle. But perhaps that forgetting is exactly why his story matters now. So how did Finarfin truly defy Morgoth? Not with a sword, though he eventually fought in the War of Wrath. Not with dramatic gestures or fiery speeches, though he possessed the eloquence of his house when needed. Finarfin's defiance of the dark enemy was more subtle, and, in its own way, more profound than any of the legendary battles recorded in the Silmarillion. Morgoth's entire strategy, from the First Age through the Third, was based on corruption from within. He sought to turn the free peoples against each other, to amplify their flaws, to twist their virtues into vices. Pride became arrogance. Courage became recklessness. Love became possessiveness. The Silmarils themselves, beautiful beyond measure, became the focal point for oaths that destroyed those who swore them. The divisions between the houses of the Noldor, between the kindreds of the Eldar, between elves and dwarves and men, all of these served Morgoth's purposes even when he was locked away in Angband, because they weakened the opposition and prevented the unity that might have threatened him. The kinslaying at Ulqualinde was Morgoth's greatest victory that didn't involve his own direct action. He had planted the seeds through his earlier manipulation and deception, and those seeds bore terrible fruit. Elf slaying elf, the Noldor staining themselves with innocent blood, the kindreds divided perhaps forever. This was what Morgoth wanted, for the free peoples to destroy themselves, to make his work easier. And then Finarfin turned back. This single decision, made on the cold shores of Aramin with the doom of Mandos still echoing in the air, represented a fundamental rejection of everything Morgoth had been working toward. It was a refusal to let pride overrule wisdom. It was choosing reconciliation over division, humility over vengeance, long-term healing over short-term satisfaction. By turning back, by submitting to the Valor's judgment, by accepting his share of blame and seeking forgiveness, Finarfin denied Morgoth the total corruption of Finwë's house. Yes, Feanor was lost, consumed by his own fire, dying early in the war he had started, his sons bound by their terrible oath to commit further kinslayings that would horrify them. Yes, Fingalfin and his children would eventually fall in battles against Morgoth's forces. But Finarfin survived, uncorrupted, maintaining the possibility of redemption for the Noldor. He proved that one could turn back from a wrong path, that forgiveness was possible, that not every error led inevitably to doom. Moreover, his work in Valinor throughout the First Age was itself a form of defiance. While Morgoth sought to break everything the Eldar had built, Finarfin preserved and renewed Noldoran culture in Aman. The craft halls continued to produce beauty. The lore masters continued to learn and teach. The music and poetry of the Noldor did not die out but evolved, incorporating the hard wisdom bought by tragedy. Finarfin created space for healing, for the rebuilding of trust, for the maintenance of hope even when news from Middle-earth grew ever darker. This was anti-Morgoth activity in its purest form. Morgoth was the spirit of destruction, of unmaking, of breaking what others had built. Every act of creation, of preservation, of healing, was inherently an act of resistance against his nature. Finarfin's quiet kingship, lacking all dramatic flair, was nonetheless a constant assertion that Morgoth would not win, that beauty and wisdom and culture would endure, that the darkness would not have the final word. And ultimately, Finarfin's path led to something his brother's path never could: victory. When the War of Wrath finally came, when the Valor moved against Morgoth in force, it was Finarfin who led the Noldor from Aman into that final battle. Not in rebellion, not in pride, not seeking personal vengeance or glory, but as part of a just war sanctioned by the powers aimed at protecting all the free peoples. This was war as it should be, undertaken reluctantly, prosecuted with righteousness, aimed at defense and liberation rather than conquest. The irony is exquisite. Feanor had sworn to wage eternal war against Morgoth, and he died almost immediately, achieving nothing except to set in motion tragedies that would destroy his sons. Fingalfin fought valiantly for centuries and gave Morgoth wounds that would never heal, but ultimately fell and left his people leaderless. But Finarfin, who turned away from war when it was driven by pride, who chose peace when it seemed like cowardice, who spent ages rebuilding rather than fighting, he was the one who actually fought in the war that defeated Morgoth permanently. In the end, the brightest gold in Aman was not the fire of battle, but the quiet shine of peace. And so we return, as all stories must, to where we began, to the golden halls of Tirion, where a throne stands that is rarely mentioned in the great tales of Middle-earth. Finarfin sits there still, in the blessed realm, ruling the Noldor who dwell in Valinor through the ages of the world. The light of the trees is long gone, replaced by the sun and moon, but their city remains beautiful, a testament to elven craft and patience, and the determination to build and preserve even after catastrophe. From his throne, Finarfin can look out across Aman and see the results of his choices, both the bitter and the sweet. The Teleri still dwell in Ulqualanda, and though the shadow of the kinslaying will never entirely fade, there is peace between the peoples. The Vanyar still live upon the slopes of Taniquetil, and the bonds between them and the Noldor have been renewed through Finarfin's long stewardship. New generations of elves have been born in Valinor, those who never knew the flight, who grew up in the world as it is now rather than as it was in the elder days, who learn of the past from stories, but whose own experience is of the slow, timeless bliss of the undying lands. And eventually, after ages beyond counting, Galadriel returned. Having finally overcome the pride that had driven her into exile, having refused the One Ring when the opportunity to claim supreme power presented itself, she earned the right to sail west. Father and daughter were reunited after millennia of separation, and one can only imagine the weight of all they had to say to each other, all the grief and loss, all the wisdom bought at terrible price, all the stories of what had been and what might have been. Through Galadriel, Finarfin learned of his children's legacies in greater detail than messengers and visions could convey. Finrod had become a legend among men as well as elves, remembered as the first of the Eldar to befriend Bear's people, as a wise king and a faithful friend. The song of Lúthien and Beren, greatest of all the tales of the First Age, could not have happened without Finrod's sacrifice. Angrod and Egnor, though they died young by elven reckoning, had lived with honor and courage, defending their people to the last. And Galadriel herself had become one of the mightiest of all the Eldar remaining in Middle-earth, had helped shape the history of the Second and Third Ages, had borne one of the 3 rings of the elves, had been instrumental in the defeat of Sauron. Finarfin's children had accomplished great things, even in exile, even under the doom of the Noldor. Their father's choice to turn back had not diminished them, but perhaps, in some way, made their own choices possible. They had not been bound by his decision. They had chosen their own paths, for good or ill. And knowing that they had lived with honor and purpose, that they had made a difference in the long war against the Shadow, must have brought Finarfin a bittersweet comfort. But Finarfin's significance goes beyond his personal story and legacy. He represents something crucial in Tolkien's moral universe, the possibility of choosing wisdom over pride, of turning back from a wrong path, of redemption through humility. In a mythology filled with tragic inevitability, where doom so often seems foreordained and every choice leads inexorably to catastrophe, Finarfin is the exception that proves the rule. He shows that tragedy is not inevitable, that choices matter, that even in the darkest circumstances there is always the option to choose differently. This is why his story, quiet as it is, matters so profoundly. Every reader of the Silmarillion knows the terrible trajectory of the flight of the Noldor, knows about the kinslaying and the doom of Mandos, knows that the rebellion will end in grief and death and failure. The story is structured as a tragedy, and tragedies by definition end badly. But Finarfin's choice interrupts that trajectory. He says, in effect, "No, not me, not my people. We will bear the shame of what we have done, but we will not continue on a path that leads only to further ruin." And because he made that choice, there remained a remnant. There remained those who preserved what was best in Noldoran culture without the corruption of the oath, without the endless cycle of vengeance and pride. There remained a testimony that the Noldor were capable of wisdom as well as skill, of humility as well as pride, of peace as well as war. In a sense, Finarfin is Tolkien's answer to the question of whether elves, or by extension, any of the free peoples, can learn and grow and change. His brothers remained locked into the paths they chose, driven by their character flaws to their inevitable ends. But Finarfin demonstrated growth. He recognized error and corrected course. He submitted to judgment and emerged wiser. He spent ages doing unglamorous work because it needed doing. He became, in the truest sense, a servant king, one who ruled not for glory or power, but because his people needed leadership, and he was willing to provide it. This is the model of kingship Tolkien ultimately valued most, not the warrior king like Finarfin, for all his courage, and certainly not the craft lord like Fëanor, for all his genius, but the king who rules in wisdom and peace, who works for the good of his people rather than personal glory, who maintains culture and civilization through the dark times, who builds and preserves rather than merely destroying what he opposes. Aragorn would eventually embody this ideal in the Third Age, but Finarfin modeled it first, in the very darkest period of the Elder Days. And his legacy flows through time in ways both obvious and subtle. Through Galadriel, his wisdom touches the Third Age. She counsels the White Council, protects Lothlorien, aids the Fellowship of the Ring. Through the Noldor who returned to Middle-earth in the War of Wrath, his influence helps reshape the world after Morgoth's fall. Through the preservation of Noldoran culture in Valinor, he ensures that the best of his people's achievements survive for elves returning from Middle-earth to rediscover. His work is not dramatic, but it is foundational. And so the ages turn, and still Finarfin rules in Tirion, a golden presence in the Blessed Realm, keeper of memory and guardian of wisdom. The great dramas of Middle-earth have largely concluded. The Third Age has ended, the ring has been destroyed, Sauron has fallen, the elves have sailed west. The world belongs now to men, who will shape it according to their nature and choices. But in Aman, beyond the circles of the world, the Eldar endure in their timeless realm. And when newly arrived souls sail into the harbor, seeking the undying lands after their long lives in Middle-earth, it is Finarfin who greets them, who welcomes them home, who helps them understand what they have left behind and what they have gained. He is the last of Finwë's sons, the one who survived everything, the one who chose wisdom when all others chose pride. His story is not the most dramatic in Tolkien's legendarium. It lacks the fire of Fëanor, the tragic grandeur of Fingalfin, the romantic heroism of his own son Finrod. But it may be the most important story of all, because it reminds us that heroism is not only found in dramatic gestures and glorious battles. Sometimes it is found in the quiet choice to turn back, to admit error, to seek forgiveness, to do the hard work of healing what has been broken. Sometimes the truest courage is not in fighting, but in knowing when to stop fighting and choose a different path. And so the ages turned, but in the West, a golden light still burns for those who remember. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.